The Monroe County courtroom had seen its share of hardened criminals, but nothing quite prepared the assembly for what they were about to witness. 19-year-old Marcus Reynolds sat at the defense table, a cocky half-smile playing across his lips as the murder victim's widow sobbed uncontrollably just 20 feet away. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgent warnings, but Marcus simply shrugged, his eyes scanning the packed gallery like a celebrity surveying his fans. He believed with every fiber of his being that his youth and charm would save him from the consequences of his actions. What he didn't know was that the person who would ultimately seal his fate was sitting in the third row, her face a mask of internal conflict, his own mother, Rachel Reynolds. Before we dive into this shocking case, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what you think should happen to defendants who show no remorse in court. Your engagement helps us bring you more of these deep dive investigations. The victim was Thomas Brennan, a 47-year-old insurance broker who had lived a life of remarkable ordinariness until the night of March 15th turned his suburban existence into a headline. This is the story of how one young man's toxic cocktail of narcissism and violence collided with the American justice system, and how the most devastating testimony didn't come from forensic experts or eyewitnesses, but from the woman who had given him life. Spring had arrived early in Riverside Heights, a meticulously planned community in Monroe County, where the streets bore names like Harmony Lane and Prosperity Drive. It was the kind of place where neighbors still waved to each other, where children rode bikes until the streetlights came on, and where the most exciting event in recent memory had been the contentious debate over whether to allow backyard chickens. The community prided itself on its safety, its schools, and its property values, a carefully constructed bubble of middle-class security that felt immune to the chaos of the wider world. Thomas Brennan embodied everything Riverside Heights represented. For 17 years, he had lived in the same modest ranch house on Oakwood Circle, a home he'd purchased after his divorce was finalized. His neighbors knew him as Tom, a quiet man with impeccable manners who kept his lawn pristine and always retrieved his garbage bins by noon on collection day. He worked downtown for Midwest Family Insurance, where he'd built a reputation as someone who actually returned phone calls and explained policy details in plain English. His daughter, Ashley, a junior at State University, was the light of his life, and their weekly Sunday phone calls were a ritual he never missed. On the evening of March 15th, Thomas followed his usual routine with the precision of a man who found comfort in predictability. He left the office at 5:30 p.m., stopped at Giovanni's Market to pick up ingredients for his trademark chicken parmesan, and arrived home by 6:15. Security footage from his doorbell camera captured him entering his home at exactly 6:17 p.m., carrying 2 grocery bags and his leather briefcase. He was wearing his work uniform, khakis, a light blue button-down shirt, and the navy blazer he always kept in his office. He looked tired but content, completely unaware that he had less than 4 hours left to live. The weather that night was unremarkable, a mild 58 degrees with clear skies and a light breeze that carried the scent of blooming magnolias through the neighborhood. Children's laughter echoed from backyards, a dog barked intermittently down the street, and the Jones family, 3 houses down, was hosting their monthly book club, their living room windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. It was the kind of night where terrible things simply didn't happen, but terrible things do happen, often without warning or reason. At approximately 9:47 p.m., Thomas Brennan's life intersected with Marcus Reynolds in the most catastrophic way possible. Marcus, who lived just 4 blocks away with his parents, had left his house around 9:15 p.m., telling his mother he was going to meet friends at the bowling alley. Security cameras would later trace his path through the neighborhood, his hands stuffed in his black hoodie, his gait casual and unhurried. He wasn't fleeing from anything, he wasn't running toward anything, he was simply walking, a predator cruising through familiar territory, looking for an opportunity. The first 911 call came in at 10:04 p.m., logged by the dispatcher as a disturbance with possible injuries at 2847 Oakwood Circle. The caller was Thomas's next-door neighbor, Patricia Moreno, a retired teacher who had been letting her cat out when she heard sounds that made her blood run cold. She told the dispatcher, "There's screaming coming from Tom's house. It doesn't sound right. Please send someone." She stayed on the line as directed, but the screaming had already stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that somehow felt worse. 2 patrol units arrived within 6 minutes, their flashing lights painting the quiet street in alternating washes of red and blue. Officers Daniel Park and Jennifer Martinez approached the house with standard caution, noting that the front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Officer Park called out, announcing their presence, but received no response. With weapons drawn, they entered the home, their flashlights cutting through the darkened interior. What they found in the living room would haunt them for years to come. Thomas Brennan lay on his side near the coffee table, surrounded by a spreading pool of blood that had soaked into the cream-colored carpet. His shirt was torn open, revealing multiple stab wounds across his chest and abdomen. Furniture was overturned, framed photos lay shattered on the floor, and a table lamp had been knocked across the room, its bulb shattered. The violence of the scene was immediately apparent. This had not been a quick, efficient killing. It had been sustained and brutal, indicating either profound rage or a complete absence of humanity. Officer Martinez immediately called for paramedics, while Officer Park checked for a pulse, already knowing what he would find. Thomas Brennan was dead, his eyes open and staring at nothing, his hand outstretched toward the phone that lay just beyond his reach. The dispatch log would later show that Thomas had attempted to dial 911, but had only managed to press 91 before he was overcome. In his final moments, he had fought to survive, to call for help, to hold on just a little longer, but it hadn't been enough. The scene told a horrific story. The struggle had begun near the front door and moved through the living room. Blood spatter on the walls indicated arterial spray, suggesting at least one major vessel had been severed. The sheer number of wounds, investigators would later count 14 separate knife strikes, spoke to a level of violence that far exceeded what was necessary to kill a single man. This wasn't murder out of necessity or panic. This was murder as an expression of something dark and primal. Within 30 minutes, the quiet street had transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the property, neighbors gathered in small clusters on sidewalks, whispering and speculating, and a mobile command unit had been set up in Patricia Moreno's driveway. Detective Sarah Chen, a 15-year veteran of Monroe County's homicide unit, arrived just before midnight, her practiced eye immediately taking in the chaos of the scene. She had worked dozens of murders, but something about this one felt different. The violence was too personal, too intense, yet the victim had no known enemies, no criminal history, no obvious motive for someone to want him dead. The initial walkthrough yielded few answers, but many questions. Thomas's wallet was on the kitchen counter, containing $143 in cash and all his credit cards. His laptop sat undisturbed on the dining room table. A $2,800 watch was still on his wrist. The TV, gaming system, and other valuables were untouched. This systematically eliminated robbery as a motive, leaving the investigators with the most unsettling possibility. This was a targeted killing, or worse, a random act of violence by someone who killed for the sake of killing. The medical examiner arrived at 1:15 a.m., and his preliminary assessment confirmed what the investigators already suspected. Time of death was estimated between 9:45 and 10 p.m. The cause of death would be determined through autopsy, but the 14 stab wounds told their own story. Several had penetrated vital organs, any one of which could have been fatal, but the killer hadn't stopped with one, or two, or even three. They had continued long after Thomas ceased to be a threat, long after he had stopped moving, driven by something that defied rational explanation. The notification to Ashley Brennan, Thomas's daughter, came at 2:30 a.m. She was pulled from her dorm room by campus police and driven to the station, where Detective Chen had to deliver the news that no parent should die and no child should hear. Ashley's initial reaction was disbelief so complete that she actually laughed, a short, bitter sound that quickly dissolved into choking sobs. "No," she kept repeating. "No, I just talked to him on Sunday. We're supposed to have lunch next weekend. No, you have the wrong person. Check again." But there was no mistake. The man who had raised her alone after the divorce, who had never missed a school play or soccer game, who had helped her move into her dorm room just 7 months earlier, that man was gone, stolen by an act of violence so senseless it defied comprehension. The community's reaction mirrored Ashley's disbelief. By morning, news of the murder had spread through Riverside Heights like wildfire, transmitted through text messages, social media posts, and hushed conversations at the grocery store. Thomas Brennan wasn't just a victim, he was everyone's neighbor, everyone's co-worker, everyone's friend. If someone like him could be murdered in his own home on a quiet Tuesday night, then no one was safe. The carefully constructed illusion of suburban security had been shattered, and the cracks were spreading. A makeshift memorial appeared on Thomas's lawn within hours. Neighbors brought flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, creating a growing testament to grief and confusion. "You will be missed," read one note. "Why?" asked another. Patricia Morono placed a framed photo of Thomas smiling at last year's neighborhood barbecue, a moment frozen in time when life was normal and death was something that happened to other people in other places. Meanwhile, 60 blocks away at the Monroe County Police Headquarters, Detective Chen and her team were beginning the methodical process of building a case. They had a crime scene rich with physical evidence, but frustratingly lacking in obvious suspects. The neighborhood canvassing had yielded no witnesses to anyone entering or leaving the house. No vehicles were seen speeding away. No suspicious characters had been reported in the area. It was as if the killer had materialized out of thin air, committed an act of extreme violence, and vanished like smoke. But killers don't vanish. They leave traces, and in the age of ubiquitous surveillance, those traces are increasingly digital. The break in the case came from an unexpected source, a Ring doorbell camera mounted on a house 2 blocks away. The homeowner, a tech enthusiast named Kevin Wu, had installed a network of cameras around his property after a package theft the last year. One of his cameras, positioned to capture his driveway, also caught a slice of the sidewalk on Oakwood Circle. At 9:43 p.m., it recorded a figure walking past, heading in the direction of Thomas's house. At 10:02 p.m., the same figure walked past again, this time moving more quickly, heading back toward the neighborhood's main entrance. The footage was grainy, shot in night vision mode, but it was enough. The figure was young, male, wearing dark clothing and a distinctive hoodie with white drawstrings. He walked with the loose-limbed gait of a teenager, hands in pockets, seemingly without a care in the world. The timestamp was devastating. 9:43 p.m. put him near the scene within minutes of the estimated time of death, and 10:02 p.m. was mere seconds before Patricia Morono's 911 call. Detective Chen had the footage enhanced by the department's digital forensics team, and they worked through the night to pull every possible detail from the pixelated images. The analysis revealed several key features. The suspect was approximately 5'10" to 6 feet tall, thin build, Caucasian, with a distinctive walk that favored his right side slightly. The hoodie appeared to be a common brand, but the way the drawstrings hung, one significantly longer than the other, was a unique identifier. With a possible suspect profile developed, the investigation shifted to identification. Who in this neighborhood fit the description? Who would have a reason to target Thomas Brennan? Who had the capacity for such violence? The answer was closer than anyone imagined. By noon on March 16th, less than 15 hours after Thomas Brennan's body was discovered, Detective Chen's team had canvassed every house within a 4-block radius. They showed the enhanced security footage to dozens of residents, asking if anyone recognized the walk, the build, the distinctive hoodie. Most shook their heads, their faces pale with the realization that a killer had walked their streets. But at the 7th house on Maple Drive, something shifted. The door was answered by a woman in her mid-40s, her face lined with premature worry and her eyes carrying the wake of 1,000 sleepless nights. Rachel Reynolds identified herself and invited the detectives inside, her movements careful and controlled. When shown the footage, her reaction was subtle but telling, a slight catch in her breath, a momentary tightening around her eyes, a hand that moved unconsciously to her throat. "Do you recognize this person, Mrs. Reynolds?" Detective Chen asked, watching the woman's face carefully. Rachel stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. That could be a lot of people," she said slowly. "A lot of teenagers dress like that." "But do you recognize anything specific about this person?" Chen pressed gently. "The walk, perhaps? The way they carry themselves?" Rachel's composure began to crack. "Why are you asking me this? What does this have to do with Mr. Brennan? My son knew him. He used to mow his lawn 2 summers ago, but Marcus wouldn't. He couldn't." Her voice trailed off as the implications of her own words hit her. "Is Marcus home, Mrs. Reynolds?" "He's sleeping. He was out late last night, but he came home before 11. He was with friends." "Would you mind if we spoke with him?" The request hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Rachel Reynolds looked from Detective Chen to her partner, Detective James Morrison, her expression cycling through denial, fear, and a terrible dawning realization. "Do I need to call a lawyer?" she whispered. "That's entirely your right, ma'am. But we just want to ask Marcus a few questions. If he was with friends last night, he might have seen or heard something useful." It was a lie by omission, and Rachel knew it, but she also knew that refusing would make her son look guilty, and she couldn't quite believe, not yet, that her Marcus, her baby, could be involved in something so horrible. Marcus Reynolds emerged from his bedroom 20 minutes later, his hair tousled from sleep, wearing basketball shorts and a faded t-shirt. At 19, he was conventionally handsome in the way that many teenage boys are, sharp features not yet settled into their adult form, clear skin, bright eyes that held a hint of perpetual amusement. He greeted the detectives with a casual, "Hey," and dropped onto the couch with the boneless sprawl of youth. "Marcus, these detectives want to ask you about last night," Rachel said, her voice tight. "Yeah? What about it?" Marcus' tone was friendly, curious, showing no signs of nervousness. Detective Chen began with simple questions, establishing timeline and routine. Marcus explained that he'd left home around 9:15 p.m. to meet friends at Riverside Lanes, the bowling alley on Commercial Street. They'd hung out for a couple of hours, playing pool and eating nachos, before he'd walked home around 11:45 p.m. "Can anyone verify you were at the bowling alley?" Morrison asked. "Sure, like 5 people. Jake, Brandon, Tyler, the usual crew." Marcus rattled off names with easy confidence. "What route did you take to get there?" "The usual way. Down Maple, left on Oakwood, straight shot to Commercial." Detective Chen felt her pulse quicken. "Oakwood Circle. Did you see anything unusual on your walk?" "Not really. Pretty quiet. Some old lady was standing in her driveway looking at her phone. Couple houses had lights on. Normal stuff." "What were you wearing?" What I usually wear. Jeans, hoodie, sneakers. Which hoodie? For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Marcus's face. My black one. Why? Can we see it? The room's atmosphere shifted. Rachel stood up, her maternal instincts finally overriding her compliance. Why are you asking to see his hoodie? What's going on? Detective Chen turned to her. Mrs. Reynolds, we have security footage of someone walking near Mr. Brennan's house around the time of the murder. We're trying to identify that person. Your son's route and timing match the footage, and we need to rule him out as a person of interest. The words person of interest hit Rachel like a physical blow. She grabbed the back of a chair for support, her knuckles whitening. Marcus, however, remained remarkably calm. Too calm. Sure, you can see my hoodie. It's in my room, but I didn't go near Mr. Brennan's house. I barely knew the guy. The detectives followed Marcus to his bedroom, Rachel trailing behind them, her breathing quick and shallow. The room was a typical teenage disaster. Unmade bed, clothes on the floor, posters of rap artists and sports cars on the walls, a gaming setup with 2 monitors dominating one corner. Marcus pulled open his closet and reached for a black hoodie hanging among a dozen other pieces of clothing. This one? Morrison asked. Yeah. Detective Chen took the hoodie, examining it carefully. It was a common Nike design, black with white drawstrings. She checked the strings. One was noticeably longer than the other, just like in the footage. Her eyes traveled to the hem, looking for any signs of blood spatter, but the hoodie appeared clean. Too clean, perhaps, for a garment supposedly worn the previous evening. Mind if we take this for testing? Chen asked. Why would you? But Marcus cut her off. Sure, take it. I've got nothing to hide. The detectives also requested the sneakers Marcus had worn, which he provided with the same unsettling willingness. They were Nike high tops, black with red accents, and, like the hoodie, they appeared recently cleaned. As the detectives prepared to leave, Chen pulled out her phone and showed Marcus the enhanced security footage. Is this you? Marcus watched the grainy video loop 3 times, his expression neutral. Could be. I was in that area last night, but that could also be like 20 other people. Can you think of anyone who might want to hurt Mr. Brennan? No, like I said, I barely knew him. He was just a neighbor. After the detectives left, promising to be in touch, Rachel confronted her son. Marcus, tell me the truth. Were you anywhere near that house last night? Mom, I already told them. I walked past there going to meet Jake and them. That's it. I didn't do anything. Then why do they want your clothes? Because they're desperate for a suspect and I'm convenient. It's fine. They'll test everything, find nothing, and leave us alone. But Rachel Reynolds had seen something in her son's eyes that terrified her, a coldness, a calculation that she'd been trying to ignore for years. In that moment, a mother's denial began its slow, agonizing death. At 4:37 p.m. on March 17th, just 36 hours after the murder, the lab called with preliminary results. Detective Chen listened, her expression hardening, before thanking the tech and hanging up. The sneakers had tested positive for blood, not on the outside where it would be visible, but in the treads, microscopic droplets that even vigorous cleaning couldn't completely eliminate. The blood type matched Thomas Brennan's, AB negative, a relatively rare type that only 1% of the population carries. More damning still were the fibers. Caught in the hoodie's fabric were several microfibers that matched the carpet in Thomas Brennan's living room. The hoodie had been washed, the detergent was still detectable, but whoever did the cleaning didn't understand that modern forensics can find what the naked eye cannot. By 6 p.m., Detective Chen had secured both a search warrant for the Reynolds residence and an arrest warrant for Marcus Reynolds. She assembled a tactical team, knowing that despite Marcus's age, he had already proven himself capable of extreme violence. They would not underestimate him. The arrest happened at 7:15 p.m. on a cold, gray evening that felt like the inverse of the pleasant night when Thomas Brennan died. 8 officers surrounded the Reynolds home, and Detective Chen approached the front door with Morrison at her side. Rachel answered on the second knock, and the look on her face suggested she'd been expecting this moment. "Mrs. Reynolds, we have a warrant for Marcus's arrest in connection with the murder of Thomas Brennan, and a warrant to search your home." The color drained from Rachel's face. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." But no was not an option. Marcus was found in his room, gaming headset on, completely absorbed in a violent first-person shooter game. He looked up as 5 officers entered, weapons drawn, and a smile actually played across his lips, as if this too was just another game, another level to beat. "Marcus Reynolds, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Brennan. Put your hands behind your head and get on your knees." The smile widened. "This is insane! I didn't do anything!" "Hands behind your head, now." Marcus complied, but slowly, making a show of his cooperation. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked directly at Detective Chen and said, "You're making a huge mistake. My lawyer's going to destroy you." The search of his room yielded additional evidence. A knife collection displayed prominently on his wall, including several hunting knives and a tactical blade. A journal with disturbing entries about what it would feel like to kill someone. And, most damningly, a t-shirt stuffed in the back of his closet that showed signs of blood spatter despite attempts to wash it. As Marcus was led to the patrol car, neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching in stunned silence. Rachel Reynolds stood in her doorway, one hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as her son was placed in the back of the car. Just before the door closed, Marcus looked back at her and winked, actually winked, as if this were all a joke they were sharing. The interrogation room at Monroe County Police Headquarters was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. Too bright, too cold, too quiet. A single table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, a large mirror that fooled no one, and a camera mounted in the corner, its red light a constant reminder that every word, every gesture, every micro-expression would be recorded and analyzed. Marcus Reynolds sat in the metal chair with remarkable ease considering the circumstances. His hands were cuffed to a bar on the table, but he seemed untroubled by the restraint. If anything, he appeared almost amused, as if he were the subject of an interesting social experiment rather than a murder suspect facing life in prison. Detective Chen entered at 9:47 p.m., carrying a thick file folder and 2 bottles of water. She set 1 bottle in front of Marcus, a gesture of false hospitality that was part of standard interrogation technique, and took the seat across from him. Detective Morrison positioned himself to the side, silent and observing, adding psychological pressure through his mere presence. "Marcus, I need to advise you of your rights," Chen began, and proceeded through the Miranda warning with practiced precision. Marcus listened with barely concealed boredom, nodding at appropriate intervals. "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them?" "Yeah, I'm not stupid." "Do you wish to have an attorney present?" This was the critical question. A smart suspect, especially one guilty of a serious crime, would immediately request counsel, ending the interrogation before it began. But smart and wise are not the same thing, and Marcus Reynolds was a living embodiment of that distinction. "I don't need a lawyer," he said, leaning back as much as his restraints allowed. "I didn't do anything wrong. Let's just get this over with so I can go home." Detective Chen felt a surge of satisfaction. His arrogance was going to be his undoing. The interrogation began softly, almost conversationally. Chen asked about his relationship with Thomas Brennan, about the lawn mowing job 2 summers ago, about the neighborhood. Marcus answered easily, confidently, painting himself as a former employee who barely remembered his one-time boss. "So you haven't had any contact with Mr. Brennan recently?" No, why would I? No arguments, no bad blood from when you worked for him? It was cutting grass, not rocket science. He paid me, I cut his grass. End of story. Detective Chen let him settle into comfort before shifting gears. Marcus, we have security footage of someone matching your description walking near Mr. Brennan's house at approximately 9:43 p.m. on March 15th. Can you explain that? I already told you I was walking to meet my friends. That area is on the way. And you're certain you were on your way to the bowling alley? Positive. Then why did your friend Jake tell our officers this morning that the group wasn't meeting until 10:30 and that you never showed up? The first crack appeared in Marcus's composure. It was subtle, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, a fraction of a second delay before answering. Jake's confused, or you guys misunderstood him. We have statements from Jake, Brandon, and Tyler. All three say the same thing. You weren't there. So where were you, Marcus? I was walking around. Is that a crime? Walking around where? Just around the neighborhood. Near Mr. Brennan's house? Maybe. I don't remember exactly. I wasn't paying attention to which house was which. Detective Chen opened the file folder and pulled out an enlarged photo of the doorbell camera footage. She slid it across the table. This is you, isn't it? Marcus barely glanced at it. Could be. Like I said, I was in that area. That's a very distinctive hoodie. Nike, black, with one drawstring significantly longer than the other. We have that exact hoodie in our evidence room. It was in your closet. Lots of people have black Nike hoodies. Not with that specific defect. Your mother confirmed she'd been meaning to fix those drawstrings for months. A longer pause this time. Marcus's brain was working, recalculating, searching for the angle that would let him slip free. Okay, so it's probably me in the video. So what? I was walking through my own neighborhood. Last time I checked, that's not illegal. You're right, it's not. But you know what is illegal, Marcus? Murder. I didn't murder anyone. Detective Chen pulled out another photo, this one from the forensics lab, showing the blood detected in his sneaker treads. Can you explain how Thomas Brennan's blood ended up in your shoes? For the first time, genuine emotion crossed Marcus's face, not fear or remorse, anger. That's impossible. You planted that. We didn't plan anything. The blood was tested by an independent lab. AB negative, same as the victim. Only about 1% of the population has that blood type. What are the odds? I want a lawyer. There it was, the words that would end the interrogation. But Chen had gotten what she needed. She'd watched Marcus lie repeatedly, caught him in contradictions, and documented his progression from false confidence to panic. More importantly, she'd confirmed what she'd suspected from the start. Marcus Reynolds had no remorse, no conscience, no humanity. He was angry not because he'd killed someone, but because he'd been caught. Interview terminated at 11:03 p.m. at suspect's request for legal counsel, Chen said for the record, then stood and walked out, leaving Marcus alone with the reality of his situation finally beginning to sink in. The next morning, Marcus was arraigned in district court. His parents had scrambled to hire David Foster, a criminal defense attorney with a solid reputation and a track record of getting reduced sentences for young offenders. Foster was a realist. He took one look at the evidence summary and knew he wasn't fighting for acquittal. He was fighting to keep his client out of prison for the rest of his life. The prosecution was led by Catherine Blackwell, a veteran assistant district attorney known for her methodical approach and her unshakable demeanor in court. She'd prosecuted 24 murder cases and lost only one. She was not interested in plea deals, not interested in reduced charges. She wanted Marcus Reynolds tried as an adult and put away forever. The arraignment lasted less than 15 minutes. Marcus pleaded not guilty. Bail was set at $2 million, effectively no bail for a family of modest means, and a preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. As Marcus was led from the courtroom in his orange jumpsuit, he looked back at his mother in the gallery and offered her a reassuring smile, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this." But Rachel Reynolds did not smile back. She sat frozen, her face a mask of horror, staring at a son she no longer recognized. Over the following weeks, as the preliminary hearing approached, David Foster worked tirelessly to construct a defense from the rubble of evidence against his client. His strategy was multifaceted, but fundamentally flawed by one insurmountable obstacle: Marcus himself. Foster's plan was to paint Marcus as a troubled young man suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues, possibly conduct disorder or even early-stage psychopathy, who had experienced a psychological break. He would argue that Marcus's youth and compromised mental state made him less culpable, that he needed psychiatric treatment rather than life imprisonment. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. The problem was that Marcus refused to cooperate. During their jail meetings, Marcus treated Foster with the same contempt he showed everyone else. He rejected any suggestion that he needed psychiatric help, insisting he was perfectly sane, and that the whole thing was a misunderstanding that would blow over once the jury heard his side of the story. "What is your side of the story?" Foster asked in exasperation during one particularly frustrating session. "That I didn't do it," Marcus replied with a shrug. "Marcus, listen to me very carefully. Do not ever say anything like that again. Not to me, not to the guards, not to other inmates, and especially not in court. Do you understand?" Marcus rolled his eyes. "Relax, I know what I'm doing." But he didn't. He had no concept of the danger he was in, no understanding that his narcissism and need to appear intelligent were leading him directly toward a life sentence. The trial of the state of Ohio versus Marcus Reynolds began on a gray Monday in late June, 4 months after Thomas Brennan's murder. The Monroe County Courthouse, an imposing neoclassical building that had stood for nearly a century, was besieged by media trucks and curious onlookers. The case had captured regional attention not just because of its brutality, but because of the defendant's age and his increasingly bizarre behavior during pre-trial appearances. Jury selection had taken 3 grueling days. Catherine Blackwell sought jurors who could handle graphic evidence and wouldn't be swayed by sympathy for a young defendant. David Foster looked for anyone with children, anyone who might see Marcus as redeemable rather than monstrous. In the end, they seated 12 jurors and 3 alternates, a diverse group ranging from a 28-year-old accountant to a 67-year-old retired postal worker, 7 women and 5 men, all of whom had sworn they could judge the case on evidence alone. The courtroom was packed to capacity. In the front row of the gallery sat Ashley Brennan, Thomas's daughter, flanked by family members and victim advocates. Her face was gaunt, her eyes carrying the weight of months of grief and a desperate need for justice. 3 rows back sat Rachel Reynolds, deliberately separated from her son by the architecture of the court. She sat alone, her husband conspicuously absent, her face a carefully maintained mask that hid the war raging within her. Marcus sat at the defense table in a navy suit his parents had purchased for the trial, his hair neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven. David Foster had coached him extensively on courtroom demeanor: sit up straight, maintain a neutral expression, show respect for the proceedings. For the first 10 minutes, Marcus followed instructions. Then the prosecutor began her opening statement, and everything Foster had worked to build began to crumble. Catherine Blackwell approached the jury with the bearing of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Her voice was clear, measured, and devastating in its precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the next week, you're going to hear about a murder. Not a crime of passion, not an act of self-defense, not an accident or a mistake. You're going to hear about a calculated, brutal killing of an innocent man in his own home. Thomas Brennan was a father, a neighbor, a man who had done nothing to provoke, nothing to deserve what happened to him on the night of March 15th. She walked them through the timeline, Thomas arriving home from work, the security footage showing him entering his house with groceries, the peaceful evening shattered by violence. She described the crime scene in detail, graphic enough to make several jurors visibly uncomfortable, but clinical enough to avoid objections. The evidence in this case is overwhelming. You will see the defendant on security camera walking toward the victim's house minutes before the murder. You will hear testimony about the victim's blood found in the defendant's shoes. You will learn about fibers from the victim's home found on the defendant's clothing. You will see the defendant's own journal where he wrote about his fascination with violence and death. As Blackwell spoke, Marcus sat at the defense table and his facade began to slip. Foster had warned him that the prosecution would be aggressive, but Marcus had assumed he could handle it. What he hadn't anticipated was how listening to his actions laid bare in clinical detail would affect him, not with shame or remorse, but with a perverse pride. When Blackwell mentioned his journal, Marcus actually smiled. Just a flicker, barely a second, but enough for 3 jurors to notice. When she described the 14 stab wounds, Marcus leaned over and whispered something to Foster, whose face went pale and he urgently shook his head. Blackwell concluded her opening statement with a direct look at the jury. The defendant thought he could get away with murder. He thought his age would protect him. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. But the evidence doesn't lie, and by the end of this trial, you will have no doubt that Marcus Reynolds is guilty of first-degree murder. She sat down, and the weight of her words hung in the air. David Foster stood for the defense's opening statement, knowing he was climbing an almost vertical wall. His strategy was to acknowledge the evidence while reframing it through the lens of Marcus's youth and mental state. Members of the jury, my client is 19 years old. 19! His brain is not fully developed. That's not an opinion. That's neuroscience. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, doesn't finish developing until the mid-20s. Marcus Reynolds is not a calculating monster. He's a teenager who made a catastrophic decision that he will regret for the rest of his life. Foster painted a picture of a troubled young man who had fallen through the cracks, undiagnosed mental health issues, a family struggling to cope, a society that failed to intervene before it was too late. He spoke of Marcus's difficult childhood, his isolation, his desperate need for help that never came. Yes, Thomas Brennan died, and that is a tragedy, but sending a 19-year-old to prison for life doesn't bring him back. It just creates another tragedy. I ask you to see Marcus Reynolds not as a monster, but as a young man who desperately needs help, who deserves a chance at rehabilitation. It was a compelling argument, delivered with genuine emotion. But as Foster spoke, Marcus undermined every word. He slouched in his chair. He examined his nails. At one point, when Foster mentioned deep remorse, Marcus actually snorted, quietly but audibly enough for the court reporter to note it in the transcript. Foster concluded and sat down, and he looked at his client with barely concealed frustration. Marcus, oblivious, leaned over and whispered, "Good job, man. They're eating it up." They weren't. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days, each piece of evidence another nail in Marcus's coffin. Catherine Blackwell called 32 witnesses, each adding another layer to the comprehensive narrative of guilt. Detective Chen testified about the investigation, walking the jury through the doorbell footage, the forensic evidence, and the interrogation. She remained professional and composed even when Foster tried to suggest investigative incompetence or bias. The medical examiner testified about Thomas Brennan's injuries in clinical detail. 14 stab wounds, several defensive wounds on his hands and forearms indicating he'd tried to protect himself, evidence of a prolonged struggle. The cause of death? Exsanguination from multiple injuries, including a severed carotid artery and punctured lung. As the medical examiner spoke, showing photographs on the courtroom monitors, Ashley Brennan wept quietly. Several jurors looked away from the screens, their faces tight with discomfort. Marcus Reynolds looked directly at the images, his expression one of detached curiosity, as if he were watching a documentary about someone else's crime. The forensic experts testified about the blood in Marcus's shoes, a perfect match to the victim, with odds of 1 in 47 billion that it belonged to anyone else. They testified about the carpet fibers on his hoodie, the blood spatter patterns on the t-shirt found in his closet, the DNA evidence that placed him at the scene beyond any reasonable doubt. Foster cross-examined each witness aggressively, but he was fighting gravity. The evidence was simply too strong, too comprehensive, too irrefutable. We're reaching the halfway point of this incredible case, and if you're as captivated as we are, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to The Guilt Line. We've got the most shocking part of this story still to come, and you won't want to miss it. The most damaging testimony came on day 3, when the prosecution introduced Marcus's journal. Found in his bedroom during the search, it was a spiral-bound notebook filled with his handwriting, dating back almost 2 years. Catherine Blackwell read selected passages to the jury, her voice steady but her content chilling. Everyone thinks they're so special, so important, but we're all just meat. That's what people don't understand. We're just temporary arrangements of meat and bone. The only difference between alive and dead is circumstance. Another entry from 2 months before the murder. Watched a documentary about predators tonight. The interesting thing isn't the killing, it's the power dynamic, the moment when the prey realizes it's prey, that moment of understanding. I wonder what that feels like from both sides. And finally, from 1 week before Thomas Brennan's death, everyone's walking around pretending they're safe, pretending the walls they build actually mean something. But walls are just illusions. Anyone can walk through a door. Anyone can decide to change someone else's story. The question isn't what if, it's why not. The courtroom was silent as Blackwell read. These weren't the ramblings of a troubled teen crying out for help. These were the calculated thoughts of someone contemplating murder as an intellectual exercise. Foster objected, arguing that journal entries were not evidence of a specific crime, just evidence of a troubled mind. Judge Patricia Hartman overruled him. The defendant's state of mind is directly relevant to this case, counselor. The jury can weigh the significance themselves. As Blackwell submitted the journal into evidence, Marcus leaned back in his chair and muttered, "He's taking that completely out of context." Foster grabbed his arm urgently, whispering harshly, "Be quiet." But the damage was done. 2 jurors had heard him, and their expressions made it clear that they didn't think any context could excuse those words. The prosecution rested on the afternoon of day 4, having systematically built an unassailable case. The evidence was overwhelming, the timeline was clear, and Marcus's own words had condemned him. Now it was the defense's turn, and David Foster knew he was about to perform the legal equivalent of building a sandcastle against an incoming tide. David Foster's defense strategy was straightforward because his options were limited. He couldn't contest the evidence, so he had to reframe it. His entire case rested on 3 pillars: Marcus's age, his compromised mental state, and the possibility of rehabilitation. He needed the jury to see not the crime, but the human being who committed it. His first witness was Dr. Leonard Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist who had examined Marcus and prepared a comprehensive psychological evaluation. Dr. Hoffman had impeccable credentials, 30 years of experience, author of 2 textbooks on adolescent psychology, expert testimony in over 200 cases. Foster guided Dr. Hoffman through his findings with careful precision. The psychiatrist testified that Marcus exhibited traits consistent with conduct disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and possible early-stage antisocial personality disorder. He explained these terms in language the jury could understand, describing them not as excuses, but as clinical realities. The adolescent brain, Dr. Hoffman explained, is fundamentally different from an adult brain. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding of consequences, is still developing. This means that teenagers, particularly those with underlying psychological issues, are far more likely to engage in risky or harmful behavior without fully comprehending the implications. In your professional opinion, Foster asked, did Marcus Reynolds fully understand the consequences of his actions on the night of March 15th? On an intellectual level, yes, he knew that killing someone was wrong and illegal, but on an emotional level, on the level that allows most of us to empathize with others' suffering and therefore refrain from causing harm, no, I don't believe he possessed that capacity. It was compelling testimony from a respected expert, but Catherine Blackwell's cross-examination methodically dismantled it. Dr. Hoffman, you testified that Marcus understood intellectually that murder was wrong, correct? That's correct. And he took steps to conceal his involvement, washing his clothes, hiding evidence, which demonstrates he understood he could be caught and punished. Yes, but... So he understood the difference between right and wrong, and he understood consequences. Those are the legal standards for criminal responsibility, are they not? Legally, yes, but psychologically. Doctor, how many murderers have you evaluated who don't have some form of personality disorder or mental health issue? Dr. Hoffman paused. Very few, but that's exactly my point. We need to treat the underlying condition, not simply punish. I'm not asking about treatment philosophy. I'm asking this. Do you believe that everyone with conduct disorder or narcissistic traits is incapable of controlling their violent impulses? No, of course not. In fact, millions of people live with these conditions and never harm anyone, correct? That's correct. So Marcus Reynolds made a choice that millions of others in similar psychological circumstances choose not to make. It's more complicated than that. But ultimately, he chose to take a knife, enter Thomas Brennan's home, and stab him 14 times. That was a choice, wasn't it? Dr. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably. A choice influenced by compromised cognitive and emotional functioning. But still a choice. Yes. Blackwell had achieved her goal, establishing that while Marcus might have psychological issues, he still bore responsibility for his actions. Mental illness might explain behavior, but it didn't excuse murder. Foster's next witness was Marcus's high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patricia Ellis, who testified about Marcus's academic decline and social isolation. She described a bright student who had gradually withdrawn, whose behavior had become increasingly concerning, and whose parents had resisted suggestions for psychological evaluation. I recommended counseling multiple times, Mrs. Ellis said, her voice heavy with regret. But his mother always said he was fine, that he was just going through a phase. I wish I'd pushed harder. The testimony was meant to show a system failure, a young man crying out for help that never came. But on cross-examination, Blackwell brought out Marcus's disciplinary records, the fight with another student, which witnesses said Marcus had started without provocation, the threatening note he'd written to a female classmate, explicit and disturbing enough that the girl's parents had considered pressing charges, and the incident where he'd been caught in the science lab after hours, allegedly trying to borrow dissection tools. These weren't cries for help, were they, Mrs. Ellis? These were acts of deliberate cruelty and violation. I think he was troubled and didn't know how to express it. Or he knew exactly what he was doing and simply didn't care about the consequences. Foster's final witness was Marcus's rehabilitation specialist, who testified about programs for young offenders, the neuroplasticity of the adolescent brain, and the potential for change. It was hopeful, optimistic testimony meant to give the jury an alternative to life imprisonment. But Catherine Blackwell's cross-examination destroyed that hope in 5 minutes. Tell me, in your professional experience, what's the success rate of rehabilitation of offenders who show no remorse? The specialist hesitated. It's lower than those who demonstrate remorse. And offenders who exhibit narcissistic personality disorder? Also challenging. And offenders who commit premeditated violence against strangers? The recidivism rates are concerning. So we're talking about taking a significant gamble with public safety based on the hope that someone who has shown no remorse, no empathy, and no capacity for change might somehow transform? With proper treatment and supervision, how many years of treatment? 10, 20, 30? And what happens if it doesn't work? Do we tell Thomas Brennan's family, "Sorry, we gave him a chance and he killed again"? The specialist had no answer. Through all of this testimony, Marcus sat at the defense table, and his behavior grew increasingly problematic. He yawned during Dr. Hoffman's testimony. He shook his head dismissively when Mrs. Ellis expressed regret. During the rehabilitation specialist's testimony, he actually laughed quietly at something. No one knew what, but several jurors heard it and turned to look at him with expressions of disgust. David Foster was losing control of his own case, undermined not by the prosecution, but by his client's inability to perform even basic human decency. The defense rested after 2.5 days, their case a fragile construction of expert opinions and systemic critiques that paled against the fortress of evidence the prosecution had built. But Foster had one more card to play, though he didn't yet know it. Before closing arguments, Judge Hartman announced that the court would hear victim impact statements. This was somewhat unusual. Such statements typically came during sentencing, not during the guilt phase of trial, but the judge determined that understanding the full impact of the crime was relevant to the jury's deliberations. Ashley Brennan was the first to approach the podium. She clutched a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling so badly the paper rattled. She was 20 years old, but grief had aged her. The vibrant college junior from the photos shown earlier in the trial was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out version carrying weight no one her age should bear. "My dad was my best friend," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The courtroom fell absolutely silent, everyone straining to hear. "He raised me by himself after the divorce. He never missed a parent-teacher conference, a soccer game, a recital. He taught me how to drive, how to change a tire, how to stand up for myself." Her voice cracked, and she paused to collect herself. Marcus, at the defense table, continued examining his fingernails. "The last time I talked to him was Sunday, March 13th. We talked about my classes, about his work, about nothing important. I told him I'd see him in 2 weeks when I came home for spring break. That was supposed to be in 4 days. 4 days." Tears streamed down her face now, her composure breaking. "He died alone and terrified in his own home, the home where he'd lived for 17 years, the home where he felt safe. And the person who did this to him is sitting right there," she pointed at Marcus, "and he doesn't even care. He's not even listening." She was right. Marcus was staring at something on the table, his expression bored. "I'll never get married with my dad walking me down the aisle. My children will never know their grandfather. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone for the rest of my life will have this hole where he should be. And it's all because—" her voice rose, anger replacing grief, "because that boy decided one night that my father's life meant nothing." She returned to her seat, supported by her aunt, her body shaking with sobs. The jury sat motionless, several women wiping their eyes. 2 more family friends spoke, painting a picture of Thomas Brennan as a man beloved by his community, a loss that rippled far beyond his immediate family. And then something unexpected happened. As the third speaker finished and Judge Hartman prepared to move on to closing arguments, a commotion arose from the gallery. Rachel Reynolds stood up, her face pale but resolute. "Your Honor," her voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom, "I need to speak." Judge Hartman looked surprised. Mrs. Reynolds, the victim impact statements are for the victim's family and, I know, but I have something the court needs to hear, something the jury needs to hear. David Foster shot to his feet. Your Honor, Mrs. Reynolds is not on the witness list, and we're past the evidence portion of, It's about my son, Rachel continued, her voice stronger now. It's about the truth, the whole truth, not the version his lawyer has been telling. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Catherine Blackwell remained seated but alert, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Judge Hartman banged her gavel. Order! Mrs. Reynolds, this is highly irregular. What specifically do you wish to address? Everything. Rachel's voice was steady now, the decision made. I want to tell the truth about what I've done, about what Marcus is, about the lies I've told myself for 19 years. Marcus, for the first time in the trial, showed genuine emotion, shock, then fury. He grabbed Foster's arm and hissed something urgent. Foster addressed the court. Your Honor, I need to confer with my client. I request a recess. But Judge Hartman was intrigued. A mother wanting to speak against her own son? This was unprecedented in her 30 years on the bench. Mrs. Reynolds, are you aware that anything you say could potentially harm your son's case? I'm aware.
And you still wish to speak? I have to. I've been silent too long already. That's how we got here. Judge Hartman made her decision. I'll allow it. But Mrs. Reynolds, you will be under oath, and you can be cross-examined by either counsel. Do you understand? I understand. Then please approach the witness stand. The bailiff swore her in. Rachel Reynolds placed her hand on the Bible, and her voice didn't waver. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She took the witness stand, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. No one, not even Catherine Blackwell, knew what was about to happen. Rachel looked directly at the jury, bypassing the attorneys entirely. My name is Rachel Reynolds, and I am Marcus's mother, and I need you to know that everything his lawyer has told you is a lie. Not because Mr. Foster is dishonest, but because I've been lying to him, lying to everyone, and lying to myself for almost 2 decades. Marcus was on his feet. What are you doing? He shouted. Shut up! Shut up right now! Mr. Reynolds, sit down, Judge Hartman commanded, her gavel cracking like a gunshot. Bailiff, restrain the defendant if necessary. Marcus slowly sat, but his eyes bore into his mother with undiluted hatred. Rachel continued, her voice gaining strength as years of denial finally broke apart. Marcus wasn't neglected. He wasn't crying out for help. He wasn't a lost boy that society failed. He was a child who showed signs of serious psychological problems from age 7, and I ignored them. I made excuses for them. I enabled them.
Rachel Reynolds' testimony wasn't legally admissible as part of the victim impact phase, but Judge Hartman had made a split-second decision that the interests of justice outweighed procedural technicalities. She instructed Catherine Blackwell to conduct the questioning as if this were part of the prosecution's case. Blackwell approached the witness stand carefully, aware she was handling something extremely fragile and potentially explosive. Mrs. Reynolds, please tell the court what you mean when you say you enabled your son. Rachel took a deep breath, and everything she'd been holding back for years came pouring out. When Marcus was 7, our neighbor's cat disappeared. I found it days later in our shed. It had been hurt, tortured. Marcus told me he'd found it that way, but I knew. In my gut, I knew he'd done it, but I couldn't accept it. So I convinced myself he was telling the truth, that some other neighborhood kid must have done it. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for Rachel's voice. When he was 9, a boy at school accused Marcus of pushing him off the playground equipment. The boy broke his arm. Marcus said it was an accident. The school wanted to suspend him, but I fought them. I said they were targeting my son, that the other boy was lying. I threatened to sue.
Marcus never faced any consequences. She described incident after incident, small cruelties that escalated over the years, each one explained away, covered up, denied. Marcus stealing money from her purse and blaming his younger cousin. Marcus deliberately breaking another student's science project and claiming it was an accident. Marcus caught with violent pornography on his computer at age 13, which Rachel had rationalized as typical teenage curiosity. By the time he was 15, I was afraid of him, Rachel admitted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Not physically, he never hit me, but there was something in his eyes, a coldness, like he was studying me, figuring out how to manipulate me. And I let him, because I didn't know what else to do. I kept thinking if I just loved him enough, if I just supported him enough, he would change. Catherine Blackwell asked gently, Mrs. Reynolds, did Marcus ever explicitly discuss harming someone? Not directly, but 6 months before Mr. Brennan was killed, we had an argument. I'd found his journal, the one that's been entered into evidence. I'd read some of it, and I was terrified. I told him we needed to get him help, that he needed to talk to a therapist, and he just looked at me with this smile and said, I don't need help, Mom. I'm not the one with the problem. The problem is that everyone else is weak. What did you do in response? Rachel's face crumpled. Nothing. I did nothing. I told myself it was just teenage edginess, that he was trying to seem tough. I put the journal back and never mentioned it again. She looked directly at Ashley Brennan in the gallery, her eyes brimming with tears. I'm so sorry. I'm so deeply, profoundly sorry. I knew something was wrong with my son. I knew he was dangerous, and I did nothing because I didn't want to face the truth about what I had raised. David Foster rose for cross-examination, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. He had to try to salvage something for his client, but how do you cross-examine a mother confessing to the world that her son is a monster? Mrs. Reynolds, you love your son, don't you? I did, I do, I don't know anymore. Her voice was hollow. How do you love someone who has no capacity to love you back, who only sees you as a tool to be used? Isn't it possible you're being too hard on yourself, that you're experiencing guilt and projecting? No. Rachel's voice was firm. I watched him in this courtroom for the past week. I watched him yawn when the medical examiner described what he did to Mr. Brennan. I watched him smirk when that poor girl talked about losing her father. I watched him, and I finally saw him, not the son I wanted him to be, but the person he actually is. Foster tried another angle. The defense has presented evidence of psychological disorders. Doesn't that explain? It explains nothing, Rachel interrupted. Plenty of people have psychological problems and never hurt anyone. Marcus made choices. He chose to torture that cat. He chose to hurt other children. He chose to walk to Mr. Brennan's house that night with a knife. Those were choices, not symptoms. Foster had nothing else. He sat down, and in doing so, effectively conceded the trial. Marcus, who had been silent since his earlier outburst, finally spoke. His voice was cold, controlled, and more frightening for its lack of emotion. You're pathetic. You're weak, just like everyone else. You think this matters? You think turning on me makes you brave? It doesn't. It just makes you a traitor, and I will never forgive you for this. Judge Hartman banged her gavel. Mr. Reynolds, another outburst and you'll be removed from the courtroom.
Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. Remove me? Go ahead. This whole thing is a joke anyway. You're all too stupid to see it. Bailiff. No, let me talk. You want the truth? Here's the truth. Marcus stood, and David Foster desperately tried to pull him back down, but Marcus shook him off. I did it. Yeah, I killed him. And you know what? It was easy. Easier than I thought it would be. He begged, actually begged, and I just watched him die. And I felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, Nothing, because he didn't matter. None of you matter." The courtroom erupted. Judge Hartman banged her gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. Bailiffs moved toward Marcus, who continued his rant even as they grabbed his arms. "You think prison scares me? You think your punishment means anything? I'm 19. I've got decades to figure a way out, to find a loophole, to—" They dragged him from the courtroom, his voice echoing down the hallway until a door slammed shut. In the stunned silence that followed, no one moved, no one spoke. They had just witnessed something rarely seen in a courtroom, a narcissist's mask completely shattered, revealing the void beneath. Rachel Reynolds sat in the witness stand, tears streaming down her face, but her posture was straighter than it had been in years. She had told the truth, and while it had destroyed any chance her son had at leniency, it had freed her from nearly 2 decades of denial and complicity. Judge Hartman called a recess, giving everyone time to process what had just happened. When court reconvened an hour later, Marcus was back at the defense table, but he was shackled now, and 2 bailiffs stood directly behind him. His face was a mask of cold fury, but he remained silent. Catherine Blackwell's closing argument was brief. It didn't need to be lengthy. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence. You've heard expert testimony. You've heard from the victim's family, and you've heard from the defendant himself in his own words, admitting to the murder of Thomas Brennan. Not just admitting it, but bragging about it, showing not a shred of remorse or humanity." She paused, making eye contact with each juror. "The defense has asked you to see Marcus Reynolds as a troubled young man deserving of sympathy and rehabilitation, but you've seen who he really is. You've heard his own mother tell you that she knew he was dangerous and that she failed to protect others from him. You've heard him confess, not in a moment of emotional breakdown, but with cold pride. The law is clear. First-degree murder requires premeditation and intent. Marcus Reynolds thought about killing someone. He chose his victim. He armed himself with a knife. He entered Thomas Brennan's home, and he stabbed a defenseless man 14 times. That is the definition of first-degree murder, and that is what you must find him guilty of." David Foster's closing argument was the saddest performance anyone in that courtroom had ever witnessed. He was a good lawyer, trying to defend an indefensible client who had systematically destroyed his own case. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Marcus Reynolds is a good person," Foster began. "After what you've heard, I can't. What I'm asking you to consider is this. Is a 19-year-old's life worth nothing? Is there no possibility, however slim, that treatment and intervention might create change?" He talked about the science of the adolescent brain, about the concept of rehabilitation, about the purpose of the justice system. But his words felt hollow even as he spoke them, echoing in a courtroom that had just heard a defendant brag about murder. "I'm asking you to see Marcus Reynolds as a human being, flawed and broken, but human nonetheless, and to consider that life in prison, with the possibility of parole after many years, might serve justice better than life without parole, which gives up on the very idea of redemption." He sat down, and the courtroom understood what everyone had known from the start. This trial was never about innocence. It was about how severely society would punish a monster. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. In a trial this emotionally charged, with this much evidence, the speed of the deliberation was actually notable. It took time to review all the evidence and fill out the verdict forms properly. But there was never any real doubt. When the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached, the courtroom filled quickly. Ashley Brennan returned to her seat in the front row, flanked by family members, her face a mixture of hope and dread. Rachel Reynolds sat alone in the back, having been ostracized by her own family for her testimony. She had done the right thing, but righteousness came at a cost. Marcus was led into the courtroom in his shackles, his expression unreadable. The smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to define. Not quite fear, but perhaps the first glimmer of realization that his invincibility had been an illusion. Judge Hartman addressed the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The moment stretched, time seeming to slow as the paper traveled from the foreman to the bailiff to the judge. Judge Hartman read it silently, her face revealing nothing, then handed it to the court clerk. "Will the defendant please rise?" Marcus stood, David Foster beside him. For the first time in the trial, Marcus looked small, diminished, the reality of the moment finally penetrating his narcissism. In the matter of the State of Ohio versus Marcus Reynolds, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? The clerk's voice was clear and steady. "We find the defendant, Marcus Reynolds, guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Ashley Brennan collapsed into her aunt's arms, sobbing. Rachel Reynolds dropped her face into her hands. Marcus stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally something that might have been fear. Judge Hartman continued, "On the charge of felony murder, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of aggravated burglary, how do you find?" "Guilty." Guilty on all counts. Marcus Reynolds had been convicted of first-degree murder with specifications, which in Ohio carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison with possible parole after 20 years, or life without the possibility of parole at the judge's discretion. Judge Hartman thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. She then announced that sentencing would take place in 2 weeks, giving the probation department time to prepare a pre-sentence investigation report, though everyone in the courtroom knew that report would be purely academic. As Marcus was led from the courtroom, he looked back one final time, not at his mother, who sat weeping quietly, not at the victim's family, who had waited months for this moment. He looked at the jury, and his expression was one of pure contempt, as if even now, convicted and facing life in prison, he believed they were all beneath him. The 2 weeks between conviction and sentencing were a media frenzy. Rachel Reynolds gave a single interview to a local news station, explaining her decision to testify against her son. "I failed Thomas Brennan," she said. "I failed his family. I failed every person Marcus ever hurt, but I couldn't fail the truth anymore. If my testimony saves even one life by showing parents that love is not enough, that denial is dangerous, then maybe some good can come from this horror." The interview went viral, sparking national conversations about parental responsibility, the warning signs of violence, and the limits of rehabilitation. Ashley Brennan started a foundation in her father's name, focused on victim support and community safety. She gave no interviews, but released a statement. "My father was a quiet man who never sought the spotlight. He just wanted to live his life, do his job, and love his family. In his memory, I will fight to make sure that predators like Marcus Reynolds are identified and stopped before they can hurt anyone. No family should endure what we endured." Before we get to the sentencing, if this case has moved you, if you're invested in seeing justice served, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us continue bringing you these in-depth investigations into the cases that matter. The sentencing hearing took place on a humid afternoon in mid-July. The courtroom was once again packed, the air conditioning struggling against the combined body heat of hundreds of people desperate to witness the final chapter of this tragedy. Judge Hartman entered, and the room fell silent. She was known as a fair but tough judge, someone who followed the law precisely but never lost sight of the human beings affected by her decisions. We are here for the sentencing of Marcus Reynolds, who has been convicted by a jury of his peers of murder in the first degree, felony murder, and aggravated burglary. Before I impose sentence, the court will hear from the victim's family. Ms. Brennan, you may approach the podium." Ashley Brennan walked to the podium, older than her years, carrying the weight of her grief with dignity. She didn't read from notes this time. She spoke directly to the judge, and her words were simple but devastating. "Your Honor, my father was a good man, a simple man who worked hard, paid his taxes, and tried to make the world a little better by educating young people. He didn't deserve what happened to him. He died terrified and in pain, alone in his own home, because a monster decided that my father's life meant nothing." She turned to look at Marcus, who stared back with empty eyes. "I don't believe in mercy for people who show no mercy to others. I don't believe in second chances for people who destroyed someone's only chance. I'm asking you to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Let Marcus Reynolds spend the rest of his life in a cage, thinking about the man he killed and the future he threw away, and let him do it knowing that he will never, ever be free again." She returned to her seat, and the courtroom remained silent. Judge Hartman then addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Reynolds, you have the right to make a statement before I impose sentence. Do you wish to do so?" David Foster whispered urgently to his client, undoubtedly advising him to express remorse, to apologize, to show some human feeling that might convince the judge to allow for the possibility of parole. But Marcus Reynolds had never been good at taking advice. He stood, and when he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, utterly lacking in any sense of remorse or humanity. "I don't have anything to say to these people. They wouldn't understand anyway." Judge Hartman stared at him for a long moment. "Is that all?" "That's all." She nodded slowly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Reynolds, I have presided over criminal trials for 30 years. I have sentenced murderers, rapists, child abusers, and every variety of criminal. But I have never encountered anyone quite like you. You are not a victim of circumstance. You are not a troubled youth crying out for help. You are a cold, calculating predator who killed an innocent man and showed no remorse whatsoever." She paused, and the courtroom held its collective breath. "Your own mother testified against you, not out of malice, but out of a moral obligation to tell the truth about what you are. Your attorney did everything in his power to save you from yourself, and you sabotaged him at every turn. The jury heard the evidence and rendered a verdict in barely 3 hours. Everyone in this system has tried to find some shred of humanity in you, and you have shown us nothing but contempt." Judge Hartman leaned forward, her gaze boring into Marcus. "The law gives me discretion in sentencing. I can impose life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, which would give you a chance at freedom if you could demonstrate rehabilitation. Or I can impose life without the possibility of parole, meaning you will die in prison. That decision is mine to make, and I do not make it lightly." The courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed deafening. "I have considered your age. I have considered the testimony about your psychological state. I have considered the arguments about rehabilitation and redemption, but I have also considered the brutality of your crime. I have considered your absolute lack of remorse. I have considered your own words in this very courtroom bragging about killing Thomas Brennan. And I have considered the testimony of your own mother, who told us that she knew you were dangerous and that she believes you are beyond rehabilitation." Judge Hartman picked up her gavel, and her voice rang through the courtroom with finality. "Marcus Reynolds, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the crime of murder in the first degree. You will be remanded to the custody of the Ohio Department of Corrections, where you will remain for the rest of your natural life. You will never walk freely again. You will never harm another innocent person, and you will spend decades contemplating the fact that your arrogance and narcissism cost you everything." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo forever. And for the first time since the trial began, Marcus Reynolds' facade completely crumbled. Not with remorse or apology, but with the terrified, desperate realization of a narcissist confronting a reality he cannot manipulate or escape. "No," he said, his voice rising. "No, you can't do this. I'm 19. I have rights. "You have no rights that you did not forfeit when you murdered Thomas Brennan," Judge Hartman said coldly. "Bailiffs, remove the defendant." As they grabbed his arms, Marcus began to struggle, his carefully maintained composure dissolving into panic. "This isn't fair. I deserve a chance. You can't do this. I'll appeal. His voice faded as he was dragged from the courtroom, still protesting, still believing that somehow, some way, his intelligence and manipulation would save him. But it wouldn't. The door closed behind him, and Marcus Reynolds vanished into the Ohio prison system, where he would spend the next 60 or 70 years in a concrete box, his brilliance and narcissism meaning nothing, his life reduced to a cautionary tale about the consequences of believing yourself above the law. In the months and years following the trial, the case of Marcus Reynolds became a touchstone in discussions about juvenile crime, parental responsibility, and the limits of rehabilitation. Rachel Reynolds moved out of state, her marriage having ended in divorce. She became an advocate for parents of troubled children, speaking at conferences about the importance of intervention, the dangers of denial, and the need to prioritize public safety over parental pride. "I loved my son," she told audiences, "but love is not enough, and sometimes loving your child means admitting that they are dangerous and need to be stopped." Ashley Brennan graduated from college and went to law school, focusing on victims' rights and criminal justice reform. The foundation she established in her father's name helped dozens of other families navigate the trauma of violent crime. She never married, never had children, carrying the weight of her father's absence through every milestone. Thomas Brennan's house on Oakwood Circle was sold within a year of the murder. The new owners didn't know its history until after they'd moved in, but they stayed, determined not to let tragedy define their home. The neighborhood memorial remained for nearly 3 years before weather finally erased it, the flowers and candles replaced by grass and normalcy. David Foster continued practicing law, but he told colleagues that the Reynolds case was the hardest of his career. "I've defended guilty people before," he said. "That's part of the job. But Marcus Reynolds was different. He didn't just refuse to help himself, he seemed to actively want to be punished. Or maybe he genuinely believed he was too smart to be convicted. Either way, it was the first time I felt relieved to lose a case." Detective Sarah Chen retired 2 years after the trial, having helped put dozens of violent offenders in prison. But she told a reporter that the Reynolds case stayed with her. "It was the look in his eyes when he confessed," she said. "Most people, even the bad ones, show something. Guilt, fear, sadness. But Marcus showed nothing. It was like looking into a void." And Marcus Reynolds? He sits in a maximum security prison in southern Ohio, inmate number 873422. He's in general population now, having lost his initial protective custody status after multiple disciplinary infractions. Prison records show he's been written up for fighting, for contraband, for threatening staff. He participates in no rehabilitation programs, shows no interest in education or therapy. He spends his days in his cell or the yard, still believing he's smarter than everyone else, still convinced that somehow he'll find a way out. But he won't. The appeals process has been exhausted. The evidence was too strong, the trial too clean, the confession too clear. Marcus Reynolds will die in prison, his narcissism and intelligence meaning nothing in a world where the only currency that matters is the ability to follow rules and show basic human decency, qualities he has never possessed and likely never will. The case raised uncomfortable questions about evil, about nature versus nurture, about whether some people are born without the capacity for empathy, or whether it's systematically destroyed through neglect and trauma. Mental health professionals still debate whether Marcus Reynolds was a psychopath from birth or created through years of maternal enabling, but ultimately those questions are academic. What matters is that Thomas Brennan, a good man who hurt no one, who dedicated his life to teaching and helping others, was murdered in his own home for no reason at all. What matters is that his daughter will never hear his voice again, that his students lost a teacher who genuinely cared, that a community lost a neighbor who made their lives better just by being present. And what matters is that justice, however imperfect, however delayed, was ultimately served. Marcus Reynolds believed he was untouchable, that his intelligence and manipulation would protect him from consequences. He learned, in the hardest way possible, that he was wrong. The courtroom video of his final moments before sentencing, as the reality of life in prison crashed through his narcissistic delusions, became a training tool in law enforcement academies, not as entertainment, but as a reminder that justice doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a 19-year-old smirking killer finally understanding that the game is over and he lost. Rachel Reynolds' testimony became legendary in legal circles, the mother who chose truth over denial, justice over love, and who carried that choice as both a burden and a badge of honor for the rest of her life. The case of Marcus Reynolds stands as a testament to the power of evidence, the importance of speaking truth even when it costs everything, and the reality that some people, regardless of age or circumstance, make choices so monstrous that society has no option but to remove them permanently from the possibility of harming others. Thomas Brennan's grave in Riverside Memorial Cemetery is still visited regularly by former students, colleagues, and neighbors. The epitaph, chosen by Ashley, reads simply, "Beloved father, teacher, friend, your light lives on in those you touched." Marcus Reynolds will never see that grave, will never make amends, will never have the opportunity to demonstrate the rehabilitation his lawyer promised. He will simply exist in a cell, aging slowly, his brilliance wasted, his life a cautionary tale, until eventually, decades from now, he dies, and the world moves on without him. That's the story of Marcus Reynolds, the teen killer who mocked the system, who believed he was untouchable, and who discovered too late that justice, however slow, is inexorable. If this story impacted you, please hit that like button, subscribe to The Guilt Line, and share this video with others who appreciate deep-dive true crime analysis. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this case, and let us know what case you'd like us to cover next. Thank you for watching, and remember, the thin line between truth and deception is often drawn by those brave enough to speak the truth, even when it costs them everything.